Depression isn't one thing. It's an entire spectrum of conditions that most people lump together under a single word, and that's a problem. Because the type of depression you're dealing with changes everything, from how it feels, to how long it lasts, to what actually works against it. So today, we're breaking down every major form of depression with zero fluff and zero filler, starting with the one everybody already knows, but almost nobody fully understands. Major depressive disorder. This is the baseline. When someone says I have depression, this is what most people picture, and statistically, they're probably right. 21 million adults in the United States experienced at least one major depressive episode in 2021. That's 8.3% of all adults. 1 in every 12 people walking around had their brain actively working against them, and it doesn't hit everyone equally. 10.3% of women compared to 6.2% of men. Young adults age 18 to 25 had the highest prevalence at 18.6%, which means nearly 1 in 5 young adults experience a major depressive episode in a single year. Let that sit for a second. Here's how it actually gets diagnosed. You need 5 or more symptoms persisting most of the day, nearly every day, for at least 2 weeks. And at least one of those symptoms has to be either a depressed mood or anhedonia, which is the clinical term for losing interest or pleasure in things you used to enjoy. Your brain essentially cancels your subscriptions to happiness without telling you. The full list includes sleep changes, appetite shifts, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness, impaired concentration, psychomotor changes, and thoughts of death. You don't need all of them, you need 5. Most people with MDD could check off way more than 5. On the biology side, it's a dysfunction across 3 major neurotransmitter systems: serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Your brain's chemical messaging service is sending everything to the wrong address. Genetic factors account for roughly 40 to 50% of your risk, so if depression runs in your family, you're not imagining the pattern. Now here's the part nobody talks about enough. An untreated episode typically resolves on its own within 7 to 9 months. That sounds almost hopeful until you hear the next stat. Approximately 70% of people who recover will experience another episode within 5 years. This isn't something you beat once and move on from. It's fundamentally a recurrent condition, which means treating a single episode without planning for the next one is like fixing a leak without checking the rest of the pipe. And the treatment gap is genuinely concerning. About 39% of adults with a major depressive episode received zero treatment in 2021. None. Among those with severe impairment, 74.8% received treatment in the past year, which sounds decent until you realize that means a quarter of people with severe life-disrupting depression still got nothing. And for the broader population with MDD, nearly 2 in 5 people were completely on their own. But if MDD is depression, that comes in episodes and eventually lifts. What happens when it just never fully goes away? That's a different beast entirely. Persistent depressive disorder. If major depressive disorder hits like a hurricane, persistent depressive disorder is the overcast sky you stopped noticing 3 years ago, and that's exactly what makes it dangerous. Here's the thing, PDD requires a depressed mood most of the day, more days than not, for at least 2 straight years. 1 year if you're a kid or teenager. 2 full years of waking up and feeling like the color's been drained out of everything. On top of that, you need at least 2 additional symptoms: poor appetite or overeating, insomnia or hypersomnia, low energy, low self-esteem, poor concentration, or hopelessness. And here's the kicker. You can never go more than 2 consecutive months without symptoms during that entire period. 2 months is your maximum window of relief. That's it. About 1.5% of US adults have PDD in any given year. 1.9% of women, 1.0% of men. Lifetime prevalence sits at 2.5%, with peak rates hitting 2.3% in the 45 to 59 age group. Those numbers sound small until you remember these are people who've been depressed for years at a time, not weeks. Now, before you think, well, at least it's less severe than MDD, hear me out. The DSM-5 actually merged the old diagnoses of chronic major depression and dysthymic disorder into this single category, because researchers realized they were clinically and neurobiologically similar enough that keeping them separate didn't make sense anymore. They're the same beast wearing different clothes. But here's where it gets really complicated. The defining psychological experience of PDD is that people stop recognizing it as depression. It's been there so long, woven into so many years of their life, that they genuinely believe this is just their personality. They're not sick. They're just a negative person. They're just low energy. They're just not that happy. They've literally forgotten what normal feels like because they haven't experienced it since they were teenagers. That's not a personality trait. That's a medical condition wearing a very convincing disguise. And despite being less acutely severe on a symptom-by-symptom basis, the cumulative damage is staggering. 49.7% of people with PDD experience serious impairment, not moderate, serious. The chronic nature means years of underperformance at work, years of strained relationships, years of decisions made through a fog of low-grade misery, stack enough slightly bad days on top of each other for a decade, and the total wreckage can match or exceed what a major depressive episode does in months. Early onset cases make it even worse. If PDD starts before age 21, you're looking at greater comorbid anxiety, higher rates of personality disorders, and significantly more treatment resistance. Basically, the earlier it digs in, the harder it is to pull out, which is, not ideal for a disorder that already specializes in being invisible. So you've got a condition that's less dramatic than MDD, lasts way longer, convinces people it isn't real, and gets harder to treat the younger it starts. Nobody talks about this one, and that's part of the problem. But if you think a quiet, slow-burning depression is hard to deal with, wait until we get into a disorder where depression is only half the story. Bipolar disorder. Everyone thinks bipolar disorder is about mania, the wild highs, the reckless spending, the 3 days without sleep, and yeah, that's part of it. But here's the thing nobody talks about. People with bipolar disorder spend the vast majority of their time depressed, not manic, depressed. The numbers are honestly kind of staggering. Bipolar 1 patients spend about 36% of their time in depressive episodes versus only 1% in full manic states. That's a ratio of roughly 3 to 1. And bipolar 2 is even worse. 37% of their time depressed compared to 0.2% hypomanic. That's a ratio of nearly 4 to 1. So when people picture bipolar disorder as this constant roller coaster of extreme highs and lows, the reality is it's mostly just lows, with the occasional spike upward that everyone fixates on. Let me break down the actual difference between the two types. Bipolar 1 requires at least one full manic episode, meaning 7 or more days of elevated mood so severe it either lands you in the hospital or completely derails your life. Usually separate depressive episodes come with it. Bipolar 2 is a different animal. You need at least one hypomanic episode, which lasts at least 4 days, is less severe, doesn't include psychotic features, and critically, you need at least one major depressive episode on top of that. So bipolar 2 isn't bipolar light, it's actually associated with more time spent depressed overall. Now here's where it gets complicated and genuinely dangerous. Bipolar depression doesn't look the same as regular unipolar depression. It comes with higher rates of what clinicians call atypical features: increased appetite instead of decreased, sleeping too much instead of too little, psychomotor retardation, which basically means everything slows down, your movements, your thinking, all of it, and mood reactivity, where something good happens and you temporarily feel better before sliding right back down. These features are going to come up again later, so keep them in the back of your mind, but the most critical difference is treatment, and this is potentially life-saving information, so pay attention. If someone with bipolar depression gets prescribed a standard antidepressant without a mood stabilizer, it can trigger a manic episode, just flips the switch, which is, not ideal. This is exactly why misdiagnosis is so dangerous with bipolar disorder. Someone shows up to their doctor depressed, gets put on an SSRI, and suddenly they're in a full manic episode that could have been avoided. The actual treatment backbone for bipolar disorder is mood stabilizers like lithium, valproate, and lamotrigine. Antidepressants can sometimes be added on top, but never alone. As for the course of the illness, the median episode duration sits around 13 weeks, and over 75% of people recover within a year. Those aren't terrible odds, but rapid cycling, which means 4 or more episodes per year, and greater cumulative morbidity both predict significantly worse recovery. Onset typically hits in late adolescence or early adulthood, and the honest truth is that bipolar disorder usually requires lifelong treatment. It doesn't just go away on its own. So the next time someone reduces bipolar disorder to mood swings, remember that nearly 40% of these people's lives are spent in depression. The mania gets the headlines. The depression does the damage, but if you think your brain chemistry working against you is rough, wait until the literal sun starts doing it too. Seasonal affective disorder. Here's a form of depression that literally comes with a calendar invite. Seasonal affective disorder is depression on a schedule, and it's tied to something as basic as whether or not the sun shows up to work. The global prevalence of SAD sits at about 5%. That sounds manageable until you look at the map. For every single degree you move away from the equator, prevalence rises by 0.2%. In New Hampshire, 9.7% of the population deals with it. In Florida, 1.4%. Depression literally increases the farther north you go, which is, not ideal for anyone living in Canada or Scandinavia. Now, technically, SAD isn't even its own standalone diagnosis. In the DSM-5-TR, it's a specifier called with seasonal pattern that gets slapped onto major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder. But don't let the clinical label fool you. This thing is remarkably consistent. Episodes recur at the same time every year with such regularity that patients can often predict exactly when their symptoms will hit, like clockwork. October rolls around and your brain just goes, time to be miserable again, right on schedule. The symptom profile for winter pattern postpartum SAD is distinctive. You get the standard depressive package, depressed mood, anhedonia, hopelessness, but layered on top of that is a very specific cluster. Hypersomnia, where you're sleeping 10 or 12 hours and still feel exhausted. Intense carbohydrate cravings, like your body is convinced that if it eats enough pasta, the sun will come back. Significant weight gain, and a heavy, crushing fatigue that sits on you like a weighted blanket you never asked for. Here's where it gets interesting. The biology behind all of this involves a triple disruption, and it's surprisingly clean to explain. Reduced sunlight throws off your circadian clock, the internal system that tells your body when to sleep and when to wake up. That same lack of light drops your serotonin levels, the neurotransmitter responsible for regulating mood, appetite, and sleep. And on top of that, your melatonin balance gets disrupted, which further messes with your sleep-wake cycle. Three interconnected systems all knocked out of alignment simultaneously because the sun decided to take a vacation. Your brain is basically running on a corrupted operating system for 4 months straight. But here's the kicker, and it's one of the most satisfying treatment stories in all of psychiatry. You can fix a significant chunk of this with a lamp. Light therapy at 10,000 lux, administered for 20 to 30 minutes within the first hour of waking, achieves remission in approximately 61% of patients. The placebo group, 32%. A literal box of bright light nearly doubles your chances of getting better. No pills, no therapy couch, just aggressive photons to the face every morning. The catch is recurrence. Year to year, 50 to 70% of people with SAD will have it come back the following winter. That sounds brutal. But here's the nuance nobody mentions. Less than half of patients continue experiencing seasonal episodes long term, meaning a significant number of people eventually just stop getting them. The depression shows up for a few winters, causes havoc, and then quietly sees itself out. Not everyone gets that lucky, but more people do than you'd expect. But if you think depression tied to the calendar is rough, wait until you hear about depression tied to one of the most vulnerable moments in a person's life. Postpartum depression. Here's a stat that should genuinely disturb you. Roughly 50% of mothers with postpartum depression are never diagnosed. Half. They go through it completely alone with zero clinical support, and nobody in the medical system ever flags it. Only about 6.2% of women experiencing postpartum depression actually receive a formal diagnosis, making this one of the most under-recognized conditions in all of clinical practice, which is, not ideal considering the stakes here extend way beyond the mother. Let's back up. Postpartum depression affects approximately 1 in 10 women after childbirth. Some research puts that number closer to 1 in 7. The global prevalence sits at around 17.22%, but that number hides an enormous range depending on where you live. In Syria, the reported rate is 2.3%. In Ghana, it's 26%. That gap isn't because women in one country are biologically more resilient than women in another. It's healthcare access, it's cultural stigma around maternal mental health. It's whether your country even has the infrastructure to screen for it in the first place. The diagnosis rate tells you more about the system than the patient. Now, the biology. After delivery, estrogen and progesterone levels don't just dip, they crash. We're talking about a sudden, dramatic hormonal freefall that would destabilize anyone's neurochemistry. Layer on top of that thyroid fluctuations, elevated inflammatory markers, and the kind of sleep deprivation that would be classified as torture if you did it to a prisoner of war. Except here, it's just called having a newborn. Add the psychological weight of the entire motherhood transition, the identity shift, the pressure, the isolation, and you've got a perfect storm of biological and environmental risk factors converging at the exact moment society expects you to be glowing with joy. The DSM-5 technically defines perinatal onset as during pregnancy or within 4 weeks of delivery. 4 weeks. In clinical practice, most professionals extend that window to a full year postpartum because depression doesn't check the calendar before it shows up. Here's where it gets dark. The risk factors for postpartum depression read like a list of things society already makes harder than they need to be. Single or widowed status, prior history of depression, comorbid medical or mental health conditions, smoking or alcohol history, and here's one that's just bleak on its face: having to pay for your own healthcare. That's literally a documented predictor. The financial burden of accessing medical care increases your risk of developing a condition that requires medical care. Cool. Add that to the list, but the real gut punch is what happens when postpartum depression goes untreated. And remember, half the time it does. Untreated PPD impairs the mother-infant bond during one of the most critical developmental windows in a child's life. The baby's cognitive development, emotional regulation, and attachment security are all affected. This isn't a condition that stays contained to the patient. It radiates outward. And then there's this. Maternal suicide is one of the leading causes of maternal mortality. Not complications from delivery, not infection, suicide. suicide. That single fact should permanently reframe how seriously we take postpartum depression, because it means the gap between diagnosis and death is filled with silence. Half of affected mothers are never even identified, and the ones who fall through the cracks face consequences that can be fatal. The condition generally responds well to treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, interpersonal therapy, antidepressants, with appropriate consideration for breastfeeding and psychosocial support all show strong results. The problem was never a lack of effective treatment. The problem is that we built a system where the majority of women who need it never even get told they have it. But if postpartum depression shows how hormonal shifts can trigger a full depressive episode after pregnancy, wait until you hear about the condition that does something eerily similar every single month. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Let me be extremely clear about something before we go any further. PMDD is not PMS. It's not bad cramps in a rough week. It is a DSM-5 psychiatric diagnosis with specific diagnostic criteria, prospective documentation requirements, and neurobiological mechanisms that place it firmly in the category of depressive disorders. And it is, without question, the depression subtype most likely to be dismissed, minimized, or outright ignored. Approximately 1.6% of women and girls globally meet strict diagnostic criteria for PMDD. That's about 31 million people. Another 3.2% meet provisional criteria, meaning their symptoms are suspected but haven't been tracked long enough to confirm. And that tracking requirement is where things get interesting, because PMDD has one of the most demanding diagnostic processes of any depressive condition. To get a confirmed diagnosis, you need prospective symptom tracking across at least 2 consecutive menstrual cycles, not retrospective. Not, yeah, I feel terrible before my period. You need documented real-time logging of symptoms across 2 full cycles showing a clear pattern. At least one core mood symptom has to be present, whether that's markedly depressed mood, marked anxiety, marked mood swings, or persistent irritability. Then you need additional symptoms on top of that, things like fatigue, concentration problems, sleep changes, appetite shifts, or feeling completely overwhelmed. These symptoms have to emerge in the week before menstruation and remit within a few days after onset. Here's the part that matters most. The mood disruption has to be severe enough to substantially interfere with work, home life, and relationships in ways that are markedly different from how the person functions during the rest of the month. That's the line between PMS and PMDD. PMS is uncomfortable. PMDD is debilitating. One is an inconvenience. The other is a psychiatric condition that can destroy someone's ability to function for a week out of every month, which is, not ideal. Now, here's where the biology gets genuinely fascinating. The leading theory isn't that women with PMDD have abnormal hormone levels. Their hormones are completely normal. The estrogen fluctuations, the progesterone shifts during the luteal phase, all of it is within standard range. The problem is the brain's response. Affected individuals appear to have an abnormal serotonergic sensitivity to those normal hormonal fluctuations. The hormones do what hormones always do. The brain just reacts to them differently. It's like 2 people hearing the same song, but one person's brain interprets it as background noise and the other person's brain interprets it as a fire alarm. Same input, wildly different neurological response. This serotonin connection is exactly why SSR works so well for PMDD. Meta-analysis data shows a standardized mean difference of negative 0.57 in symptom reduction, which is a meaningful clinical effect. And here's a useful detail. Continuous dosing proves significantly more effective than luteal phase only dosing. So taking the medication all month beats taking it only during the symptomatic window, which further supports the idea that this is an ongoing neurobiological sensitivity rather than a temporary hormonal problem. Beyond SSR hormonal contraceptives containing drospirenone show efficacy for some people. Lifestyle modifications help too, things like regular exercise, stress management, and dietary adjustments. Supplements including vitamin B6, calcium, and magnesium offer additional support, though they're supplementary rather than primary interventions. The 2-cycle prospective tracking requirement makes PMDD one of the harder diagnoses to actually confirm. You can't walk into a doctor's office and get diagnosed on the spot. You need months of documented evidence. Combine that with the cultural tendency to dismiss menstrual-related complaints as normal or exaggerated, and you get a condition that affects tens of millions of people worldwide with substantial underdiagnosis persisting across the board. Millions of people cycling through severe depressive episodes every single month with zero explanation for why their life falls apart on a predictable schedule. But if PMDD challenges assumptions about what triggers depression, the next subtype challenges assumptions about what depression even looks like. A typical depression, here's a fun bit of irony to close things out. Atypical depression is called atypical, which implies it's rare or unusual. Turns out, no. A national survey found that 10.2% of the US population had lifetime depression with atypical features, compared to only 6.3% without. The atypical presentation is literally actually more common than the typical one. Psychiatry named it backwards and just never bothered to fix it, which is, not ideal. So what makes it atypical? The defining feature is mood reactivity. In standard depression, your mood stays flat no matter what happens. You could win the lottery and you'd feel nothing. Atypical depression doesn't work like that. Something good happens, your friend calls, you get a compliment, you land a date, and your mood actually lifts. You feel genuinely better for a little while. Then the depression comes back like it never left. This is what makes atypical depression so insidious and so easy to dismiss, because from the outside, it looks like you're fine. You laughed at dinner last night, so how depressed can you really be? Very. The answer is very. Beyond mood reactivity, diagnosis requires at least two of the following: significant weight gain or increased appetite, hypersomnia, leaden paralysis, and pathological rejection sensitivity. Leaden paralysis is exactly what it sounds like. Your arms and legs feel like they're filled with wet concrete. Getting out of bed isn't a motivation problem, it's a physics problem. Your body genuinely feels like it weighs twice what it should. But the rejection sensitivity is where things get really destructive. It shows up in roughly 71% of atypical depression cases, and it's not just feeling bummed when someone cancels plans. It's extreme emotional reactions to perceived, anticipated, or even imagined rejection. Someone takes too long to text back and your brain has already decided they hate you, constructed an entire narrative about why, and emotionally processed the end of the friendship, all before they reply sorry, was in the shower. This single symptom can obliterate relationships, careers, and social lives faster than almost anything else in the depression spectrum. The demographics tell an interesting story too. Atypical depression skews younger in onset, hits women 2 to 3 times more often than men, and shows strong overlap with anxiety disorders and bipolar 2. It's also associated with higher BMI and metabolic syndrome compared to other depression subtypes, which makes sense given that increased appetite and hypersomnia are literally part of the diagnostic criteria. Your body isn't just mentally struggling, it's physically changing. Here's where it gets fascinating from a treatment perspective. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOIs, achieved response rates of approximately 72% in atypical depression patients. Tricyclic antidepressants, only 44%. That's a massive gap. One of the clearest examples in all of psychiatry that subtyping your depression actually matters for choosing the right medication. But MAO is come with brutal dietary restrictions. You can't eat aged cheese, cured meats, fermented foods, basically anything enjoyable. Plus the side effect profile is rough, so clinical practice shifted toward SSRIs, which are easier to manage but don't perform quite as well for this specific subtype. Appropriately treated patients still show improvement rates around 65 to 70%, which is solid. But it's a reminder that convenience sometimes wins over effectiveness in medicine, and that's really the point of this entire video. Depression isn't one thing. It's at least 7 distinct presentations we've covered today, each with different symptoms, different triggers, different demographics, and often requiring completely different treatment approaches. Calling it all depression is like calling every injury a hurt. Technically accurate, clinically useless. The more precisely you can identify what you're actually dealing with, the better your chances of finding something that works. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.